They called her wild, unfit, a disgrace to her father's name. The town of Silver Bend whispered she'd lose everything within a year: the ranch, the cattle, her dignity. The banker sharpened his foreclosure papers. The mayor's wife smiled like a viper. But when the dust-covered cowboy walked into that general store and heard them mock her one last time, he didn't flinch. He looked straight at Arden Cole and said 5 words that would change everything. "Good. You'll match me just fine." This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The summer heat of 1878 settled over Silver Bend, Colorado like a wool blanket soaked in creek water, heavy, suffocating, and impossible to escape. Main Street baked under the afternoon sun, the wooden boardwalks creaking with each step, dust devils spinning lazy circles between the saloon and the general store. It was the kind of day when sensible people stayed indoors, when even the horses stood still in their traces, tails flicking at flies with mechanical precision. Arden Cole wasn't sensible. She'd stopped being sensible the day they buried her father. She walked down Main Street with her head high and her jaw set, boots clicking against the weathered planks with the steady rhythm of a war drum. Her riding skirt was dusty from the morning's work, her hair pulled back in a practical braid that had long since given up any pretense of ladylike arrangement. Sweat darkened the collar of her shirt. Dirt lined her fingernails. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd spent the dawn hours mending fence posts and checking water troughs while the rest of Silver Bend was still sleeping off Saturday night's whiskey. The whispers started before she reached the mercantile. There she goes again, thinks she's a man. Poor Thomas Cole. Rolling in his grave, no doubt. Give it 3 months. She'll be begging to sell by autumn. Arden didn't slow down, didn't turn her head, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing their words landed like thrown stones against her spine. She'd learned that much in the 6 months since her father's heart had given out in the north pasture, since the lawyer had read the will in his dusty office, since the town had collectively decided that a 24-year-old woman had no business running a cattle ranch. The bell above the mercantile door jangled as she pushed inside, and the conversation that had been bubbling among the cluster of women near the fabric bolts died like a candle in a windstorm. Mrs. Eleanor Alden stood at the center of the group like a queen holding court, her silk dress so pristine it looked like she'd never encountered actual dirt in her entire life. The mayor's wife had made it her personal mission to remind Arden of her place at every possible opportunity. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Why, Miss Cole? How industrious of you to venture into town looking so authentic." The pause before that last word carried enough venom to drop a bull at 20 paces. Arden met her gaze evenly. "Mrs. Alden, ladies." She nodded to the other women, most of whom suddenly found the floor fascinating. "Mr. Peterson, I need 50 pounds of oats, 2 coils of rope, and whatever nails you have in stock. Put it on my account." Harold Peterson, the mercantile owner, shifted uncomfortably behind his counter. He was a decent man, but decent men still had to pay their own bills, and the mayor's opinion carried weight in a town this size. "Miss Cole, about that account?" "I'll settle up after the fall sale," Arden said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Same as my father always did, same as every rancher in this valley does." "Your father," Mrs. Alden interjected, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "had the respect of this community. He had experience. He had—" She paused for effect. "The proper constitution for such demanding work." The other women murmured agreement, a soft chorus of judgment wrapped in propriety. Arden felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the anger that lived there now like a banked fire, always ready to flare. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself against these women who'd never touched a branding iron or birthed a calf or ridden through a lightning storm to bring in strays. The bell jangled again. Every head in the store turned toward the door. The man who stepped through was tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the frame, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested hard work rather than bulk. His clothes were worn but clean, dark trousers, a shirt that might have been blue once before the sun faded it, a bandana knotted loosely at his throat. Dust coated his boots and the lower half of his legs like he'd walked through miles of dry country. A battered hat shadowed his face, but Arden could see the sharp line of his jaw, the easy way he moved despite obvious fatigue. He was a stranger. Silver Bend didn't get many strangers. The man paused just inside the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. His gaze swept the room with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly, taking in Peterson behind the counter, the cluster of well-dressed women, Arden standing alone with dust on her clothes and defiance in her eyes. "Help you?" Peterson asked, his voice cautious. "Need supplies," the stranger said. His voice was deep, roughened by trail dust and sun. "And information, if you've got it. Looking for work. Ranch work." There was an accent there, not strong but present. Texas, Arden thought, or maybe Oklahoma. Mrs. Alden's laugh was like breaking glass. "Ranch work? In Silver Bend?" She gestured toward Arden with a flutter of her gloved hand. "I'm afraid our local attempt at ranching isn't exactly positioned to hire help. The Cole Ranch is barely keeping its head above water, though I'm sure Miss Cole appreciates the gesture of inquiry." The stranger's gaze shifted to Arden, really seeing her for the first time. Something flickered in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or assessment. "Cole Ranch?" "My family's ranch," Arden said, lifting her chin. "And we're doing just fine." "Oh, my dear girl." Mrs. Alden's smile could have curdled milk. "Everyone knows you're drowning in debt. Your father's loans, the property taxes, the cost of maintaining that sprawling disaster of a homestead. It's only a matter of time. The kindest thing you could do is sell to someone with the actual capability to run it. My husband knows several interested parties who would offer fair prices." "Fair prices," Arden repeated, her voice flat. "Your husband's interested parties have offered exactly half what the land is worth, Mrs. Alden. We both know it." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "How dare you suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Arden interrupted. "I'm stating facts. The Cole Ranch has been in my family for 30 years. It has water rights, timber rights, and 300 head of prime cattle. It's not for sale at any price, and certainly not at the insulting figures your husband's friends have proposed." Mrs. Alden's face flushed an unbecoming shade of crimson. "You silly, foolish girl! You cannot run a ranch. You're a woman. You don't have the strength, the knowledge, or the constitution for such work. You should be looking for a husband, not playing cowboy with your father's legacy." "Playing cowboy?" Arden's voice was dangerously quiet now. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "What else would you call it? Riding around in men's clothes, barking orders at the few hands who haven't abandoned you yet, pretending you understand the first thing about cattle or markets or—" "I call it surviving," Arden said, each word clipped and precise. "I call it honoring my father's life's work. I call it refusing to let vultures like your husband pick apart everything Thomas Cole built just because I have the audacity to be his daughter instead of his son." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Peterson had frozen, a bolt of fabric halfway off the shelf behind him. The stranger cleared his throat. Every eye in the room swiveled back to him. He'd been watching the exchange with an expression that was hard to read, part amusement, part something else. Interest, maybe. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing more of his face. He was younger than Arden had initially thought, maybe 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that were somewhere between blue and gray, like storm clouds over the plains. "Seems to me," he said slowly, his drawl more pronounced now, "that a woman running a ranch on her own in country like this has more constitution than most men I've known." He looked directly at Mrs. Alden. "More guts, too." Mrs. Alden's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The stranger turned his full attention to Arden. "You say you're doing fine, but are you hiring?" Arden blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden shift. What?" "Hiring," he repeated. "Ranch work, that's what I'm looking for. You've got a ranch. I'm guessing from this conversation that you could use the help, politics aside." "I don't know you," Arden said, suspicion warring with desperate hope in her chest. "You could be anyone." "Could be," he agreed. "Name's Calder Brooks. Worked ranches from the Rio Grande to Wyoming. Can show you my hands if you want proof of honest work." He held them out, palms up. They were calloused and scarred in the way that only came from years of rope burns, barbed wire, and hard labor. Miss Cole doesn't have the resources to pay proper wages, Mrs. Alden interjected, recovering her composure. She can barely pay the men she currently employs. Didn't ask about pay, Calder said without looking at her. His eyes stayed on Arden. Asked about work. Arden studied him, trying to read past the dusty exterior and the easy drawl. She'd been burned before. Men who'd taken her father's wages and left after a week, spreading stories about the wild coal girl who thought she could boss grown men around. Men who'd stolen equipment or turned up drunk or simply vanished with their first month's pay. But something in Calder Brooks' eyes was steady, direct. And God help her, she was desperate. Standard wages, she heard herself say. Room and board in the bunkhouse. You'll take orders from me or from Rafa Delgado, my foreman. You'll work from can see to can't see during busy season. I don't tolerate drinking on the job, stealing, or men who think they know better than me just because they're men. The corner of Calder's mouth twitched. Sounds reasonable. It's a hard life, Arden continued, as if he hadn't spoken. The work is brutal. The ranch is... We're fighting for every acre right now. The bank is breathing down our necks, the mayor's office is trying to force a sale, and half the town is taking bets on when I'll fail. Good, Calder said. Arden frowned. Good? That almost smile became a real one, transforming his weather-beaten face into something that made Arden's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. He tipped his hat to her, then turned that smile on Mrs. Alden and her shocked companions. Good, he repeated, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent mercantile. You'll match me just fine. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Mrs. Alden made a strangled sound of outrage. The other women erupted into scandalized whispers. Peterson looked like he was trying to decide whether to laugh or hide behind his counter. Arden felt something unfamiliar and dangerous unfurl in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. The sense that this stranger with dust on his boots and a Texas drawl had just chosen her side in a war he didn't even fully understand yet. The ranch is 5 miles northwest, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Stone gate posts, coal brand carved into the left one. You'll find it before dark if you leave now. Calder touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. I'll be there. He turned to Peterson. I'll take those supplies for Miss Cole, and add a pound of coffee to her order. Looks like she could use it. Before Arden could protest, before Mrs. Alden could recover enough to launch another verbal assault, Calder was at the counter, coins appearing in his work-roughened hand. Peterson, looking grateful for an excuse to move, began gathering the requested items with unprecedented speed. You can't just... Arden started. Call it an advance on my first wages, Calder said over his shoulder. I'll work it off. But you don't... 5 miles northwest, stone gates, coal brand. Got it. He collected the bundle of supplies Peterson had hastily wrapped, then paused at the door. He looked back at Arden one more time, and this time there was something almost like a promise in his expression. See you before sundown, Miss Cole. Then he was gone, the bell jangling in his wake, leaving Arden standing in the middle of the mercantile with her heart racing and her mind spinning and Mrs. Alden's fury crackling through the air like heat lightning. Well, Mrs. Alden said icily, I suppose that's the caliber of help you can attract. Drifters and saddle tramps who don't even ask about wages. How perfectly fitting. Arden didn't answer. She was still staring at the door, at the empty space where Calder Brooks had been standing. Something had just changed. Something fundamental. She didn't understand it yet, didn't dare name it, but she felt it in her bones the way she felt coming storms. You'll match me just fine. What kind of man saw a woman fighting alone against an entire town and decided that was exactly the kind of fight he wanted to join? My supplies, Mr. Peterson, Arden said quietly, turning back to the counter. Already wrapped, Miss Cole, Peterson said, his voice carefully neutral. About the account. I'll settle it after fall sale, Arden repeated. Same terms as always? Peterson glanced nervously at Mrs. Alden, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, after fall sale. It was a small victory, but Arden would take it. She collected her parcels, kept her spine straight, and walked out of that mercantile with the same steady dignity she'd walked in with. Let them whisper, let them speculate. Let Mrs. Alden spread whatever poison she wanted through the ladies' sewing circle and the Sunday church social. Arden Cole had work to do. The ride back to the ranch took an hour, long enough for the adrenaline of the confrontation to fade and reality to settle back in like morning frost. The Cole Ranch spread across a valley carved by Silver Creek, where the grass was still green in August, and the ponderosa pines climbed the slopes like dark green walls. It was beautiful country, hard country, the kind of land that would break you if you weren't careful, but reward you with breathtaking sunsets and clean water and cattle that practically raised themselves if you gave them half a chance. Thomas Cole had built this place from nothing. He'd arrived in Colorado Territory in '48 with a wife, a wagon, and dreams bigger than the mountains. He'd fought drought, fought winters that killed half his stock, fought claim jumpers and rustlers and every other hardship the frontier could throw at a man. And he'd won. For 30 years, he'd won. He'd built a house that didn't leak, a barn that could withstand spring storms, corrals that held the wildest Mustang. He'd run cattle when the market was good and lived on beans and determination when it wasn't. He'd raised a daughter who could read and write and shoot and ride with equal skill, who knew every inch of this land, who loved it with the same fierce passion he had. Then his heart had stopped in the middle of checking the north fence line, and Arden's world had caught fire. She spotted the stone gate posts from a quarter-mile away, the Cole brand carved deep into the weathered granite. Home. Except it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a fortress under siege, and she was the only one defending the walls. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwoods, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch that her father had added the year before he died. The barn stood to the east, red paint fading, but the structure still sound. Beyond that, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, all the pieces that made a working ranch function. And standing in front of the barn, watching her approach with faded eyes and a tobacco-stained beard, was Rafa Delgado. Rafa had been with her father from the beginning. He'd helped build the first cabin, helped deliver Arden when her mother had gone into unexpected labor during a blizzard, helped bury that same woman when fever took her 6 years later. He was 63 years old, tough as boot leather, and loyal as a hound dog. He was also one of only 2 hands who'd stayed after Thomas Cole died. "Trouble in town?" Rafa asked as Arden dismounted. "When isn't there?" Arden handed him her reins. Mrs. Alden was in rare form. Rafa spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "That woman's got a tongue sharp enough to skin a bear. She thinks I should sell, thinks I'm an embarrassment to my father's memory." Arden started pulling the supply parcels from her saddlebags. "Your father," Rafa said, his voice going rough the way it always did when he talked about Thomas, "would have been proud as hell of what you're doing here. Don't let them poison you with their talk." Arden managed a tired smile. "I hired someone today." Rafa's eyebrows shot up. "Hired? With what money?" "Standard wages, same as everyone else." She paused. "He didn't ask about the pay, just asked about the work." "He?" Rafa's eyes narrowed. "What kind of fool takes a job without asking about wages?" "The kind who walked into Peterson's Mercantile right in the middle of Mrs. Alden tearing me apart and decided to defend me to her face." Arden shook her head, still not quite believing it herself. "Name's Calder Brooks. Says he's worked ranches from Texas to Wyoming. He'll be here before dark." Rafa studied her face with the too perceptive gaze of someone who'd known her since birth. "And you believe him?" "I don't know," Arden admitted. "But we need the help, Rafa. We've got 200 head to move before first snow, fences that won't survive another storm, and water rights to defend if the McAllister Ranch keeps trying to dam the creek upstream. We can't do it with just you, me, and Tommy." Tommy Garrett was their other remaining hand, a kid barely 18 who was more enthusiasm than skill, but worked harder than men twice his age. It wasn't enough, not for what they needed to accomplish before winter. "Guess we'll see what kind of man this Brooks fellow is," Rafa said finally. "If he's running from something, or if he's the real deal." "If he shows up at all," Arden added. "For all I know, he was just making a point to Mrs. Alden, and he'll ride past the gate without stopping." But she didn't believe that. Something in the way Calder Brooks had looked at her, the steadiness in his storm-colored eyes, told her he was a man who kept his promises. The sun was touching the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, when Arden heard the sound of hoofbeats on the drive. She was in the barn, checking on a mare that had shown signs of colic that morning, her hands full of sweet feed and concern. "Someone's coming," Tommy called from the barn door. The kid had been watching the road like he expected an invasion. Arden wiped her hands on her trousers and stepped out into the fading light. Calder Brooks rode a big buckskin gelding, the kind of horse that could go all day and still have energy to spare. He'd acquired a bedroll and saddlebags since leaving town, which meant he'd either had them stashed somewhere or he traveled so light that everything he owned could be carried on one horse. Given the worn state of his clothes and the lack of a pack mule, Arden suspected the latter. He reined in 20 feet from the barn, a polite distance that showed respect for her space. Up close, in better light, Arden could see she'd been wrong about his age. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he was closer to 35, and a scar that cut white through his left eyebrow. "Miss Cole," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Brooks." Arden felt Rafa and Tommy both positioning themselves behind her, protective without being obvious about it. "You found us. Wasn't hard. You give good directions." He glanced around the ranch yard, his gaze taking in details with the practiced eye of someone who knew what to look for. "Nice spread. Good water, good grass. Your father built something solid here." "He did," Arden agreed. "Are you sure about this? Once you're on Cole payroll, you're going to be on the wrong side of town politics. Mrs. Alden will make sure everyone knows you're working for the wild Cole girl." Calder's expression didn't change. Never cared much for politics or gossip. He swung down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than out of one. "You mentioned a foreman, Rafa Delgado?" "That's me," Rafa said, stepping forward. He looked Calder up and down with the blunt assessment of a man who'd hired and fired dozens of ranch hands over 30 years. "You know cattle?" "Yes, sir." "You know horses?" "Yes, sir." "You know how to fix fence, dig post holes, work a branding iron, and ride through a thunderstorm without pissing yourself?" Calder's mouth twitched. "I do." "And you're willing to take orders from a woman half your age?" "If that woman knows what she's talking about, I don't see why not." Rafa and Calder stared at each other for a long moment. Then Rafa nodded slowly. "Bunkhouse is that building there. Bunks on the right are taken, me and Tommy. You can have your pick of the rest. Meals are at dawn, noon, and dusk. Miss Cole does the cooking, and it's damn good, so don't waste it. We start work at first light. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Don't call me sir. Makes me feel old." Rafa jerked his head toward the bunkhouse. "Get settled. We'll talk about tomorrow's work after supper." Calder nodded, gathered his horse's reins, and headed toward the barn. Arden watched him go, still trying to reconcile the reality of this stranger with the audacity of what he'd said in the mercantile. "Good. You'll match me just fine." "Well," Tommy said, his young voice bright with curiosity. "He seems all right." "We'll see," Rafa muttered, but there was something in the old man's eyes that looked almost like approval. Dinner that night was venison stew, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Arden had learned to cook from her mother before the fever and from necessity after. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and the men cleaned their plates without complaint. They ate at the long table in the ranch house kitchen, a room that had seen countless meals and conversations over the years. Calder sat at the far end, listening more than talking, answering Rafa's careful questions about his experience and his intentions without volunteering much beyond the basics. "So where were you before Silver Bend?" Rafa asked, mopping up the last of his stew with a biscuit. "South of here. Worked a ranch outside Pueblo for 2 years. Calder's voice was even, uninflected. "Before that, Kansas. Before that, Texas." "Why'd you leave?" "Pueblo Ranch sold out to a big operation from back east. New owners brought their own crew." He shrugged. "Happens." "And before Pueblo? Kansas?" Rafa was probing, looking for gaps in the story, inconsistencies that might suggest trouble. "Drought killed the herd. Owner gave up, moved back to St. Louis." Calder met Rafa's gaze steadily. "I'm not running from the law, if that's what you're asking. No angry wives, no stolen horses, no debts I can't pay. I'm just a hand looking for work. In a town where nobody's hiring, Arden said. At a ranch everyone says is doomed. Calder's attention shifted to her, and Arden felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. I've never been afraid of long odds, Miss Cole, and I don't put much stock in what everyone says. Why not? He considered the question, his calloused fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. Everyone said my father would never make anything of himself because he was Irish. Everyone said the drought in '73 would break every rancher in Texas. Everyone says a lot of things that turn out to be nothing but hot air and fear. Fear of what? Tommy asked. Change. People different from them. Things they don't understand. Calder took a long drink of his coffee. That woman in town today, the mayor's wife. She wasn't worried about you running this ranch, Miss Cole. She was scared of it. Arden frowned. Scared? Of me? Of what you represent, Calder clarified. You're doing something she was taught her whole life that women can't do. Every day you succeed, you prove that teaching wrong. That's threatening to people whose whole identity is built on those kinds of rules. The kitchen fell silent except for the crackle of the fire in the stove. Arden had never heard anyone put it quite that way before. She'd been called wild, improper, unnatural, but never threatening. That's a fancy way of saying she's a bitter old cow, Rafa said finally, and Tommy nearly choked on his coffee. Calder's smile was quick and genuine. That too. Later, after the dishes were washed and the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Arden stood on the porch and watched the stars come out over the mountains. The night was cool, a promise of the autumn that would arrive too soon, bringing with it all the challenges she'd been dreading. The bank loan was due in 2 months. Mayor Alden and his interested parties were circling like buzzards. She had 300 head of cattle that needed to make it through winter, fences that needed repair, hay that needed cutting and storing, and 1,000 other tasks that required more hands and more money than she had. And now she had Calder Brooks, a stranger who'd walked into her life for reasons she didn't fully understand. Good. You'll match me just fine. What had he meant by that? What had he seen in that mercantile that made him think she was worth defending, worth working for without even asking about pay? Arden didn't have answers. But for the first time in 6 months, she felt something other than the crushing weight of responsibility and fear. She felt curiosity. And beneath that, dangerous and unexpected, she felt hope. The bunkhouse lamp flickered through the window, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, 3 men slept. One old and loyal, one young and eager, and one who was still an unknown quantity. Tomorrow would bring work. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Tomorrow would reveal whether Calder Brooks was salvation or just another complication in a life that already had too many. But tonight, Arden allowed herself to stand under the stars and breathe deeply and imagine, just for a moment, that maybe the impossible wasn't quite as impossible as everyone believed. Maybe wild wasn't something that needed to be tamed. Maybe being unfit for the life others expected meant she was perfectly fit for the life she'd chosen. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who understood that. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and creek water and the distant promise of weather changing. Arden pulled her shawl tighter and went inside, leaving the stars to their silent vigil over the Cole ranch. In the bunkhouse, Calder Brooks lay awake on his chosen bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about a woman with fire in her eyes and dust on her boots, who'd looked at him like he might be either crazy or exactly what she needed. He'd worked 100 ranches in 15 years, drifted from job to job like tumbleweeds across the plains. He'd never stayed anywhere longer than a season or two, never put down roots, never let himself care about more than the next paycheck and the next horizon. But something about Arden Cole's straight spine and desperate courage made him think that maybe, just maybe, he was tired of drifting. Maybe it was time to stand and fight. Maybe it was time to stay. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the mountains stood guard over a valley where a woman named Arden Cole was fighting for her survival against odds that should have broken her months ago. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just gained an ally who understood exactly what it meant to be judged unfairly, to be dismissed by people who thought they knew better, to be told you weren't good enough for the life you'd chosen. Calder Brooks had spent 15 years proving those people wrong. He was happy to spend a few more months doing it again, this time for someone who deserved it. The ranch house went dark. The bunkhouse lamp flickered out. Silver Bend slept 5 miles away, dreaming its small-town dreams of propriety and profit. And in the space between darkness and dawn, between hope and despair, between the wild woman and the wandering cowboy, something began that would change everything. A partnership. An alliance. A connection neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed more than they knew. The story of Arden Cole and Calder Brooks had begun in a mercantile with an insult and a promise. Where it would end, nobody could have guessed, but it would be extraordinary. Dawn came early to the Cole Ranch, the way it always did in late summer, cool and gray, with mist rising off Silver Creek like smoke from a dying fire. Arden was already in the kitchen when the first light touched the eastern peaks, her hands working through the familiar motions of coffee brewing and bacon frying while her mind ran through the day's endless list of tasks. She heard the bunkhouse door creak open, followed by the sound of boots on packed earth. Through the kitchen window, she watched Calder cross the yard toward the pump, moving with the stiff gait of someone whose body was reminding him of yesterday's long ride. He worked the handle, ducked his head under the stream of cold water, and came up gasping, droplets catching the early light like scattered diamonds. Rafa emerged next, then Tommy, both men performing their own morning ablutions with less drama. By the time they filed into the kitchen, Arden had plates loaded with bacon, eggs, and yesterday's biscuits fried in the bacon grease the way her father had loved them. "We're starting with the south fence line," Rafa announced, sitting down at his usual spot. "Storm last week took down at least 50 yards of posts. Can't afford to lose cattle through the gaps." Calder nodded, his hair still wet and dripping onto his collar. "How much wire do we have?" "Enough for repairs, not enough for replacement," Arden said, setting the coffee pot on the table. "Which means we patch what we can and hope it holds through winter." "Hope's not much of a strategy," Calder observed, but his tone wasn't critical, just factual. "Hope's all I've got right now," Arden shot back, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. She was tired, worried about the bank, worried about the approaching deadline, worried about 100 things that kept her awake at night. Taking it out on her newest hand wasn't fair, but Calder just looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "Then we'd better make sure we've got more than hope by the time winter hits." Something in Arden's chest loosened slightly. "The south fence," she repeated. "Tommy, you're with Rafa and Mr. Brooks. I'll be checking the water situation upstream. McAllister's been damming again, and if we don't have words with him soon, we'll be dry by September." "You want company for that?" Rafa asked, his tone careful. "McAllister's got a mean streak." "I can handle McAllister," Arden said. She'd been handling him for 6 months, ever since he'd decided that a woman rancher meant easy pickings for water theft. "I don't doubt it," Rafa replied, "but sometimes it helps to have witnesses." Arden opened her mouth to argue, then caught Calder watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not judgment, exactly. More like interest, like he was trying to figure out what made her tick. "Fine," she said finally. "Rafa, you take Tommy and start on the fence. Mr. Brooks, you're with me." Calder's eyebrows rose slightly, but he just nodded. "Yes, ma'am." They rode out an hour later, following Silver Creek upstream through country that grew progressively rougher as the valley narrowed. Arden led the way on her paint mare, with Calder following on his buckskin gelding. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creek running over stones, birds calling in the pines, and the rhythmic creak of saddle leather. Finally, Calder broke the silence. "How long has McAllister been stealing your water?" Arden glanced back at him. "How did you know that's what this is about?" "You said he's been damming. That's not accidental, and you've got the look of someone who's fought this particular fight before." 6 months, Arden admitted, "ever since my father died. He figures I won't defend the water rights, or that I don't know how to prove they're mine. He's wrong on both counts." "What does the law say?" "The law says I have senior rights. My father filed first back in '51. But the law also requires that I'm putting the water to beneficial use, which means running enough cattle to justify the claim." She urged her mare around a fallen log. McAllister's been spreading rumors that I'm overstocked, that I'm not managing the herd properly, that I'm wasting water. He's trying to build a case that my rights should be forfeited. Are you overstocked? Arden twisted in her saddle to look at him directly. No, I'm running exactly the number my father ran. But McAllister has the mayor's ear and the water commissioner is his brother-in-law, so you're fighting corruption as well as theft, Calder finished. That's a harder battle than just fixing a dam. Everything about this ranch is harder than it should be, Arden said, more bitterly than she intended. But I'm not giving up, not the water, not the land, not any of it. They rode in silence for another half-mile. Then Calder said, "Tell me about your father." The question caught Arden off guard. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me. You're fighting this hard to keep his legacy alive. I figure he must have been worth it." Arden felt her throat tighten. Nobody had asked her about Thomas Cole in months. Most people in Silver Bend had immediately started talking about what would happen to the ranch now that he was gone, about Arden's inevitable failure, about who would buy the land when she finally gave up. Nobody had asked what kind of man he'd been, what he'd meant to her, why this place was worth bleeding for. "He was stubborn," she said finally. "Stubborn as a Missouri mule, my mother used to say. He came out here with nothing but determination and a dream, and he built something that lasted. He taught me everything, how to read sign, how to doctor sick cattle, how to negotiate with buyers, how to stand my ground when men tried to push me around." She paused. "He also taught me that land isn't just property, it's legacy. It's the only thing that outlasts us." "Sounds like a good man," Calder said quietly. "He was. And he loved this place the way some men love women, completely, desperately, without reservation." Arden blinked hard against the sudden burning in her eyes. When his heart stopped, he was checking fence posts. Died doing exactly what he loved, on land he'd built with his own hands. "I figure if I can't keep this place running, then what was the point of any of it?" Calder didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "The point was that he lived the life he chose, and he raised a daughter who's willing to fight for what matters. That's not nothing, Miss Cole. That's everything." Arden didn't trust herself to answer. She just nodded and kept riding, grateful that Calder had the sense to let the silence settle naturally between them. They found McAllister's dam a mile upstream, exactly where Arden had expected it, a crude but effective barrier of logs, stones, and mud that diverted most of Silver Creek into an irrigation ditch leading toward McAllister's property. The main channel was reduced to a trickle barely 6 inches deep. "Son of a bitch," Arden muttered, dismounting. "This is worse than last time." Calder swung down from his saddle and walked to the dam, examining it with a critical eye. "He's got help building this. One man couldn't move these logs alone. He's got 4 hands and 2 sons. They probably built it overnight." Arden was already pulling her work gloves from her saddle bag. "Help me tear it down before McAllister shows up." "If he's smart, he's watching right now," Calder observed. "Probably wants to catch you destroying his handiwork so he can claim you're the one causing trouble. Then let him watch. I have water rights, he doesn't. I'm not letting my cattle die of thirst because he wants to irrigate his alfalfa fields." Calder studied her for a moment, then nodded and began rolling up his sleeves. "All right, but when he shows up, and he will, let me do the talking first." "Why?" "Because you're angry, and angry people say things that get twisted in court later. I'm just hired help. Nothing I say will matter much." He pulled on his own gloves and approached the dam. "Besides, I've dealt with men like McAllister before. They respond better to other men, even when those other men are in the right for backing a woman." Arden wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle her own confrontations, but the practical part of her brain recognized the truth in what Calder was saying. Pride was expensive, and she couldn't afford it right now. "Fine," she said, "but if he starts lying about my water usage or my cattle numbers, I'm correcting him." "Fair enough." They worked together, prying logs loose and rolling stones aside, letting Silver Creek reclaim its natural channel. The water came rushing back with surprising force, swirling and churning as it found its old pathway. Arden felt a fierce satisfaction watching it flow. This was her water, her father's water, and nobody had the right to steal it. They were halfway through dismantling the dam when the sound of approaching horses made them both look up. 3 riders appeared from the tree line, a big man in his 50s with a gray beard and expensive boots, flanked by 2 younger men who had his same square jaw and mean eyes, McAllister and his sons. "Well, well," McAllister called out, reining in his horse 20 feet away. "Looks like we've got trespassers destroying private property." "This isn't your property," Arden said, keeping her voice level. "This is the creek bed, public land. That dam is mine, though, and you're tearing it apart." McAllister's smile was all teeth. "That's destruction of property, Miss Cole. I could have the sheriff out here for this." "Do it," Arden said flatly. "I'd love to explain to Sheriff Morrison why you're illegally diverting water from someone with senior rights. Again." "Senior rights?" McAllister spat the words like they tasted bad. "Your father might have filed first, but you're not using that water properly. Running too many cattle, overgrazing the land, wasting resources. That's a lie," Arden interrupted, her anger flaring hot and bright. "I'm running the exact same herd my father ran, on the same grazing schedule, with the same rotation patterns." "Miss Cole." Calder's voice was quiet but firm. He stepped slightly in front of her, not blocking her but creating a physical buffer between her and McAllister. "I'm Calder Brooks, new hand at the Cole Ranch. I've worked cattle operations from Texas to Wyoming, and I can tell you that Miss Cole's herd management is textbook perfect. She's not overstocked, not overgrazing, and not wasting anything." McAllister's eyes narrowed. "I know every hand in this valley. Never heard of you." "That's because I just arrived, but I know water law, and I know cattle management, and I know you're violating both." Calder's tone remained conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made his words hit harder. "Now, you can file complaints with the water commissioner all you want. I hear he's your brother-in-law, so I'm sure he'll listen real sympathetic. But the law's the law, and Miss Cole has senior rights dating back to 1851. That's going to hold up in any court you care to try." "You don't know what you're talking about," one of McAllister's sons growled. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Calder replied, still in that same easy tone. "I also know that stealing water from a neighboring ranch is a good way to start a range war, and range wars have a tendency to get expensive and bloody. Doesn't seem worth it just to irrigate some alfalfa." McAllister's face had gone red. "Are you threatening me?" "No, sir. Just observing that you're making a serious mistake. Miss Cole has been patient so far, more patient than a lot of ranchers would be. But patience runs out eventually." Calder gestured at the partially dismantled dam. "This is the 3rd time she's had to tear down your illegal diversions. Maybe it's time to accept that Silver Creek isn't yours to control." "She's a woman," McAllister said, as if that explained everything. "She doesn't have the spine or the resources to fight me in court, and she certainly doesn't have the backing to make trouble for me with the water commissioner or anyone else who matters in this county." "She has me," Calder said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. McAllister stared at Calder, clearly trying to figure out whether this dusty cowboy was bluffing or if he actually represented a real threat. Arden felt something shift in her chest, surprise, gratitude, and something more complicated that she wasn't ready to name. This man had known her for less than 24 hours, and he was standing between her and trouble like he'd been hired to do exactly that. "You're making a mistake," McAllister said finally, directing his words at Calder rather than Arden. "Cole Ranch is going under. Bank's going to foreclose before Christmas. Whatever wages she promised you, you won't see them." "That's my concern, not yours," Calder replied. "And we're going to finish removing this dam now. You're welcome to watch, or you can ride back to your ranch and save yourself the aggravation." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then McAllister jerked his horse's head around viciously and spurred it back toward the tree line, his sons following with backward glances that promised future trouble. Arden waited until they'd disappeared before letting out the breath she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Calder said, turning back to the dam. "That's what you're paying me for. I'm paying you to fix fences and work cattle, not face down my neighbors." Calder pulled another log free, muscles straining under his shirt. "Way I see it, protecting this ranch includes protecting you from men who think they can push you around just because you're a woman. That's part of the job." Arden grabbed a stone and heaved it aside, letting the physical work burn off her residual anger and confusion. You meant what you said about standing with me. I don't say things I don't mean, Miss Cole. They finished destroying the dam in silence, working side by side until Silver Creek ran free and clear again, the water singing over stones in its natural rhythm. When they were done, both of them were soaking wet and covered in mud, but the satisfaction of seeing that water flow made it worthwhile. He'll just rebuild it, Arden said, watching the creek run. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Probably, Calder agreed, but each time he does, you tear it down again. Eventually he'll figure out it's more trouble than it's worth, or you'll get enough evidence of repeated violations to take to a judge who isn't in his pocket. There isn't a judge within 100 miles who isn't in someone's pocket, Arden said bitterly. That's how it works out here. Money and connections mean more than law. Not always, Calder said. Sometimes stubbornness counts for something too. Arden looked at him, this stranger who'd appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed someone to stand beside her. The morning sun caught the water droplets in his hair, turned his eyes the color of creek water over stones. He was watching her with an expression that was becoming familiar, steady, direct, without judgment or pity. Why did you really come to Silver Bend? She heard herself ask. Why take a job at a failing ranch when you could have kept riding to somewhere with better prospects? Calder was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. You ever feel like you've been running your whole life? He asked finally. Not from anything specific, just running. Moving from place to place, because staying means putting down roots, and roots mean vulnerability, and vulnerability means someone can hurt you. Yes, Arden said softly, thinking of her father's death, of the way her whole world had shattered in a single afternoon. I've been running for 15 years, Calder continued. Good reasons at first, family trouble, bad luck, circumstances beyond my control. But somewhere along the way, running just became habit. Easier to drift than to stand. Easier to leave than to invest in anything that might not work out. He looked at her directly. Then I walked into that mercantile yesterday and saw you standing there, taking abuse from people who should have been ashamed of themselves, and you weren't backing down. You weren't apologizing for being exactly who you are. And I thought, maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to stand with someone who's fighting for something real. Arden's breath caught in her throat. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had ever seen her fight and chosen to join it instead of judging it. I'm going to lose, she said, needing him to understand. The odds are impossible. The bank, the mayor, the town, they all want me to fail. And they have more resources, more power, more of everything that matters. Maybe, Calder said. Or maybe you're tougher than they think. Maybe we're tougher than they think. He picked up his hat from where he'd left it on a rock, shook the water off, and settled it back on his head. Either way, I'd rather lose fighting for something worthwhile than win at something that doesn't matter. They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, the morning sun warming their wet clothes and turning the valley into a patchwork of gold and green. Arden kept stealing glances at Calder, trying to reconcile the quiet cowboy on the horse beside her with the man who'd faced down McAllister and his sons without flinching. She has me. 2 words that had changed everything. 2 words that had drawn a line in the dust and declared which side of it Calder Brooks stood on. When they reached the ranch, Rafa and Tommy were already back from the south fence, washing up at the pump. Rafa took one look at Arden and Calder's soaking wet, mud-covered state and raised his eyebrows. McAllister? He asked. McAllister, Arden confirmed. He get physical? No, Mr. Brooks handled it. Rafa's gaze shifted to Calder with new assessment. That right? Just reminded him about water law and the disadvantages of range wars, Calder said easily. Nothing dramatic? Rafa didn't sound convinced, but he didn't push. Well, we got 50 yards of fence repaired. Need another 2 days to finish the whole section, but it'll hold for now. Good, Arden said. Tomorrow we start moving cattle down from the high pasture. I want everything consolidated in the lower valley before we have to worry about early snow. The work fell into a rhythm over the following weeks, brutal, endless, but with a sense of progress that Arden hadn't felt in months. Calder worked from dawn until dark without complaint, proving himself capable with everything from breaking horses to doctoring sick calves. Tommy followed him around like a puppy, soaking up knowledge and asking endless questions that Calder answered with surprising patience. Even Rafa, who trusted new people about as much as he trusted rattlesnakes, grudgingly admitted that Brooks knew his business. But it was the small moments that caught Arden off guard. The way Calder always made sure she ate during the midday break, quietly setting aside food when she got too caught up in work to remember. The way he backed her authority with the other hands without making a show of it, just naturally deferring to her judgment when Tommy looked uncertain. The way he could read her moods, knowing when she needed space to work through her worries and when she needed distraction in the form of dry observations about the cattle or stories from his years of drifting. One evening, 3 weeks after Calder's arrival, they were sitting on the porch after supper while Rafa and Tommy played cards in the bunkhouse. The sun had set an hour ago, and the first stars were appearing over the eastern peaks. Arden was reviewing the ranch accounts, or trying to anyway. The numbers kept blurring together, mocking her with their insufficiency. "How bad is it?" Calder asked from where he sat on the porch steps, working oil into a bridle that had started to crack. Arden didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The bank loan is due in 6 weeks. I need $3,000. I have—" She checked the ledger again, hoping the numbers might have magically changed. 843. Calder's hand stilled on the leather. "What about the cattle? When's the fall sale?" "Not until November, and even if I sell every head at top price, I'll maybe clear $1,500 after expenses." She closed the ledger with more force than necessary. "I'm $2,000 short, and I have no way to get it." "What if you sold some land?" "To who? The only people with that kind of cash are the mayor's friends, and they're offering pennies on the dollar. They know I'm desperate, so they're waiting for the bank to force me into a sale at rock bottom." Arden fought against the tightness in her throat. 6 weeks. That's all I've got left before this place becomes someone else's property. Calder set the bridle aside and stood, crossing to lean against the porch railing where he could see her face in the lamplight spilling through the window. "What about taking the herd to Cheyenne?" Arden blinked. "What?" "Cheyenne. Prices are double there, sometimes triple, depending on market. It's a risk. Long drive, lots of things that can go wrong, but if you made it, you'd have enough to pay the bank and have capital left over." He paused. "It's a long shot, but it's still a shot." "That's a 200-mile drive through rough country," Arden said, even as her mind started racing through the logistics. "We'd need at least 4 drivers, probably 5. We'd need supplies, a chuck wagon, enough horses for remounts. We've got 4 drivers. Me, you, Rafa, Tommy. Tommy's 18 and has never done a drive that long." "Then he'll learn," Calder said simply. "And I've done drives twice that distance. Rafa's forgotten more about cattle than most men ever learn. You can ride and rope better than half the cowboys I've worked with." He met her eyes steadily. "It's possible, Arden. Difficult, but possible." She noticed he'd used her first name but was too caught up in the idea to call him on it. "The bank would never extend my loan to give us time for the drive. So we don't ask for an extension. We just do it." Calder's voice was calm, confident. "We leave in a week. Push hard. Make Cheyenne in 3 weeks. Sell the herd, get back here with time to spare before the loan comes due. And if something goes wrong, if we lose cattle, if there's a stampede, if we don't get the prices we need, then we're no worse off than we are now," Calder pointed out. "You're already losing the ranch. This way, at least you're fighting for it instead of just watching it slip away." Arden stared at him, at this man who'd been in her life less than a month, but was already proposing the kind of desperate gamble that could save everything or destroy what little remained. The smart move was to say no. The safe move was to accept defeat gracefully, take whatever the mayor's friends offered, and start over somewhere else. But Arden Cole had never been particularly smart or safe. "If it's a long shot," she said slowly, "it's still a shot. We do it. We take the herd to Cheyenne." Calder's smile was brilliant in the darkness, proud, relieved, and something else that made Arden's heart skip unexpectedly. "Then we'd better start planning. We've got a lot of work to do." They stayed up late that night, mapping routes and calculating supplies, arguing over which cattle to take and which to leave behind. planning for every contingency they could imagine. Rafa joined them eventually, drawn by the lamplight and the sound of their voices, and after initial skepticism, agreed that a Cheyenne drive was their best chance. "It's crazy," the old foreman said, but he was grinning. "Thomas would have loved it. He always did appreciate a good gamble when the odds were long enough." "Then we'll do it for him," Arden said. "One last impossible thing before the ranch passes out of Cole hands forever." But even as she said it, looking at Calder across the table with maps spread between them and hope kindling bright in her chest, she didn't believe they were going to fail. For the first time in 6 months, Arden Cole believed they might actually win. The week before the drive passed in a blur of preparation that left everyone exhausted before they'd even started. Arden worked 18-hour days sorting cattle, repairing equipment, and buying supplies on credit that made her stomach twist with anxiety every time she signed her name. The general store owner, Harold Peterson, had looked at her with something between pity and admiration when she'd presented her list. "That's a lot of provisions, Miss Cole," he'd said quietly, glancing at the figures. "You planning something big?" "Cheyenne Drive," Arden had replied, meeting his eyes steadily. "Leaving in 4 days." Peterson had whistled low. "That's ambitious and risky." "Everything worth doing is risky, Mr. Peterson. Can you extend me credit or not?" He'd extended it, though Arden suspected he didn't expect to see full payment. The whole town would know about the drive within hours. Peterson's wife had been standing 3 feet away, pretending not to listen, but there was nothing to be done about it. Silver Bend would talk regardless of what Arden did or didn't tell them. True to prediction, Mayor Alden appeared at the ranch 2 days before their planned departure, riding up the drive in his fine buggy like he was paying a social call rather than circling wounded prey. Arden met him in the yard, with Calder working nearby in deliberate earshot, mending tack on the porch. "Miss Cole," Alden said, descending from his buggy with practiced political grace, "I've heard some concerning rumors about your intentions." "Then you've heard I'm taking my cattle to Cheyenne," Arden said flatly. "Not rumors. Facts." Alden's smile was oily with false concern. "My dear girl, you can't possibly be serious. A drive of that length through that terrain with your limited resources? It's suicide. You'll lose half your herd before you're halfway there. That's my concern, not yours, Mayor." "But it is my concern," Alden insisted, his tone turning paternal in a way that made Arden's teeth grind. "As a civic leader, I feel responsible for the well-being of all our citizens, especially young women who might be making rash decisions born of desperation." "There's nothing rash about it," Calder said from the porch, not looking up from the bridle he was working on. "It's calculated risk, properly planned, which is more than can be said for most business ventures in this territory." Alden's face tightened. "I wasn't speaking to you, Mr. Brooks." "No, but you're talking about my employer's business, which makes it my concern." Calder did look up then, his gray eyes cool and direct. "Unless you have legal authority to prevent Miss Cole from conducting commerce, I suggest you save your breath for people who want your advice." The mayor's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Miss Cole, I implore you to reconsider. If it's the bank loan that's driving this desperate action, I'm certain we could work out alternative arrangements. A sale at fair market value, perhaps, with enough profit for you to establish yourself comfortably elsewhere." "Get off my property," Arden said quietly. Alden blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me. Get off my property before I have Mr. Brooks escort you off." She took a step closer and had the satisfaction of seeing the mayor actually retreat. "You and your friends have been waiting for me to fail since the day my father died. You've manipulated the bank, spread rumors, tried to steal my water rights, and done everything possible to force me into selling at a fraction of what this ranch is worth. But I'm not failing, Mayor. I'm fighting. And when I come back from Cheyenne with enough money to pay that loan in full, I'm going to remember every single person who tried to profit from my grief." Alden's face had gone an unhealthy shade of red. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Cole. This community has been patient with your eccentricities, but there are limits to public tolerance." "Then it's a good thing I don't require public tolerance," Arden replied. Just legal rights, which I have. Now leave." The mayor climbed back into his buggy with wounded dignity, but his eyes promised retribution as he drove away. Arden watched until the dust settled, then discovered her hands were shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. "That went well," Calder observed dryly. "I just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county," Arden said, pressing her palms against her thighs to still the tremors. "You already had that enemy. You just stopped pretending otherwise." Calder set aside his work and stood, crossing to where she stood in the yard. "You did good, Arden. Standing up to men like that, it's harder than any physical work we'll do on this drive." "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly. "What if he's right? What if this is suicide and I'm just too stubborn to see it?" "Then we fail," Calder said simply. "But we fail trying, which is better than the alternative. And we might not fail at all. We might just surprise everyone, including ourselves." Arden looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift deeper in her chest, something that had been building since that first day in the mercantile. This man believed in her, not in some abstract way, not with condescension or pity, but with genuine conviction that she was capable of extraordinary things. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you have so much faith in this?" "In me?" Calder was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Because I've spent 15 years watching people give up when things got hard. Watched ranches fail because the owners didn't have the spine to fight for them. Watched good land go to waste because someone decided it was easier to quit than to try." He paused. "You're not a quitter, Arden. You've got steel in you that most people never find, and that's worth betting on." Before Arden could respond, before she could find words for the tangle of emotions his statement had unleashed, Rafa's voice called from the barn that they had a horse with a thrown shoe, and the moment dissolved into the practical demands of preparation. They left at dawn on a Thursday morning in early September, driving 280 head of prime coal ranch cattle toward a horizon that promised either salvation or ruin. Arden rode point with Calder, while Rafa and Tommy brought up the rear and flanks, their voices rising in the calls and whistles that kept the herd moving in the right direction. The first 2 days were deceptively easy. The weather held clear and cool, the cattle moved well, and they covered better distance than Arden had dared hope. They camped the first night beside a creek that still ran with late summer water, and sat around the fire eating Tommy's attempt at biscuits that were somehow both burned and raw. "These are terrible," Tommy admitted cheerfully, trying to saw through one with his knife. "They build character," Rafa said, dunking his in coffee until it was soft enough to chew. "First drive I ever did, the cook fell off the wagon drunk on the second day and broke his leg. We ate hardtack and jerky for 3 weeks straight." "What happened to the cook?" Tommy asked. "Left him at a way station with a bottle of whiskey and enough money to get home when he healed up. Never saw him again." Rafa squinted at his biscuit thoughtfully. "These might actually be worse than hardtack." The laughter that followed was easy and genuine, the kind that came from shared hardship and the relief of a successful day. Arden felt something loosen in her chest as she watched her small crew joke and eat and tend the fire. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone in her fight. She had people beside her who'd chosen to be there, who believed the impossible might be possible after all. Calder caught her eye across the flames and smiled, and Arden felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The third day brought their first real challenge. Dark clouds massed over the mountains to the west, moving fast with the kind of intent that promised violence. By noon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees and the wind was picking up, making the cattle nervous and fractious. "Storm's coming," Rafa announced unnecessarily, reading the sky with the expertise of 40 years watching weather in this country. "Big one." "How big?" Arden asked, though she could feel it herself, that electric tension in the air that preceded serious weather. "Big enough that we need to find shelter," Rafa said. "There's a draw about 2 miles northeast. It's not perfect, but it'll break the worst of the wind." They pushed the herd hard toward the draw, racing the storm as lightning began to flicker in the advancing clouds. The cattle were spooked now, rolling their eyes and lowing with distress, fighting against the direction the riders wanted them to go. Arden's mare was dancing sideways, responding to both the approaching storm and the nervous energy of the herd. "Easy, girl," Arden murmured, keeping her seat through her horse's nervous movements. We're almost there. They reached the draw just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, cold as creek water and hard enough to sting exposed skin. The herd funneled into the natural depression in the landscape, sheltered on three sides by rising ground and sparse tree cover. It wasn't much, but it was better than being caught in open country when the full force of the storm hit, which it did, about 10 minutes later, with the sound of a freight train and the fury of something biblical. Rain became a solid wall of water. Wind screamed through the draw, bending trees and tearing at anything not secured. Lightning cracked so close that Arden could smell the ozone, could feel the electricity crawl across her skin. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the ground and making the horses scream in terror. And then the cattle broke. It started with the animals at the edge of the herd, the ones most exposed to the storm's fury. One moment they were holding position, the next they were running, blind with panic, and the instinct spread through the group like wildfire. 280 head of cattle transformed into a living avalanche of horns and hooves and mindless fear, stampeding directly toward a ravine that would kill anything that went over the edge. "Turn them," Calder was shouting, but Arden was already moving, spurring her mare directly into the path of the panicked herd. It was insane, suicidal, the kind of thing her father had always warned her never to do. But if she didn't turn the leaders, the entire herd would go over that ravine, and 6 months of work would die in seconds. She fired her pistol into the air, the sharp crack cutting through even the storm's noise. Once, twice, 3 times, each shot aimed at making the lead cattle veer away from the ravine's edge. Her mare was screaming beneath her, fighting the bit, terrified but trusting Arden enough to stay the course. The herd was 30 feet away. 20. Arden could see the whites of their eyes, see the foam at their mouths, feel the ground shaking with the force of their passage. 10 feet. Something massive and buckskin appeared at her side, Calder on his gelding, adding his own gunfire to hers, putting himself between her and the worst of the danger. Together they created enough noise and obstruction that the lead cattle finally veered, turning away from the ravine by mere yards, and the rest of the herd followed in a sweeping arc that took them parallel to the drop instead of over it. They rode with the stampede for a quarter mile, keeping pace with the panicked animals, firing and shouting until the cattle finally began to slow, their initial terror burning out into exhausted confusion. By the time the herd came to a scattered, heaving halt, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind steady rain and the distant rumble of retreating thunder. Arden's hands were shaking so badly she could barely holster her gun. Her mare was lathered with sweat and rain, sides heaving, but miraculously uninjured. Calder was beside her, his face grim and pale beneath the water streaming from his hat brim. "That," he said, his voice rough, "was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." "Had to be done," Arden managed, though her own voice was shaking. "You could have been killed. If your horse had stumbled, if you'd been a second too slow, He cut himself off, jaw working. "Don't ever do that again." "Don't tell me what to do," Arden shot back, adrenaline making her sharp. "They're my cattle, my responsibility." "And you're no good to this ranch dead," Calder said flatly. "Next time we turn them together. You don't ride into a stampede alone. There might not be time for together. Then we make time, or we lose cattle. But we don't lose you." His eyes were fierce in his pale face. "Understand?" Arden stared at him, breathing hard, and saw something in his expression that made her breath catch for entirely different reasons. This wasn't just about the cattle or the ranch. This was personal. This was Calder Brooks terrified that he'd just watched her die, and angry that she'd taken such a risk. "I understand," she said quietly. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, rain falling around them, the herd settling into nervous grazing nearby. Then Rafa's shout broke the spell, calling them back to assess the damage and regroup. Miraculously, they'd lost only 3 head, 1 cow with a broken leg that had to be put down, and 2 calves they couldn't find in the aftermath. Given how close they'd come to losing everything, it was a victory. But as they set up a cold camp that night, too wet and exhausted to bother with a fire, Arden couldn't stop thinking about the look on Calder's face when he told her not to do that again. The next week tested them in ways the storm hadn't. The rain had turned the trail to mud that sucked at hooves and made every mile a battle. They lost 2 more head to injury, and one of the horses came up lame, forcing them to redistribute the load. Food ran low when Tommy dropped a supply bag in a creek crossing. They were all exhausted, filthy, and starting to question the wisdom of this entire venture. "How much farther?" Tommy asked on the 9th day, his young face drawn with fatigue. Arden checked the crude map they'd been following, comparing landmarks to her father's old notes about northern routes. 4 days to Cheyenne. Maybe 5 if we keep having troubles. "And if the market's bad when we get there?" Rafa asked. He was riding with a limp now, having been thrown when his horse shied at a rattlesnake 2 days back. "Then we're ruined," Arden said honestly. "But we were ruined anyway. At least this way we tried." That night, the 11th night of the drive, Arden took first watch while the others slept. The cattle were settled, the stars were brilliant overhead, and the exhaustion in her bones had reached a point beyond pain. She was standing at the edge of camp, watching the dark shapes of sleeping cattle and trying not to think about everything that could still go wrong, when Calder appeared beside her. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Slept enough," he said. "Figured you could use company." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the herd and the distant cry of a coyote. Then Calder said, "You're going to make it, you know." "To Cheyenne?" "To Cheyenne. Through winter. Through whatever else tries to break you. You're going to make it because you're too stubborn to do anything else." Arden felt her throat tighten. "I'm scared, Calder. Every day, every mile, I'm terrified that this is the moment everything falls apart." "I know," he said quietly. "But you keep moving anyway. That's what courage is, being scared and doing it anyway." "Is that what you've been doing? All those years of drifting, were you scared?" Calder considered the question. "Different kind of scared. I was afraid of staying, of investing in something that might fail, of caring about people who might leave or die or disappoint me. So I kept moving, kept my distance, never let anything matter too much." He paused. "Turns out that's its own kind of failure. Running doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone." "And now?" Arden asked, her heart beating faster. "Now I'm tired of running," Calder said. He turned to look at her directly, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity in his eyes. "I've never seen anyone fight this hard for a dream, for a place, for a legacy. It makes a man think about staying, about having something worth fighting for himself." The words hung between them like a promise and a question. Arden knew she should step back, should maintain the careful distance she'd been keeping between employer and employee, between her heart and the dangerous territory of hoping for more than survival. But she was tired of being careful, tired of being alone in her fight. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "I don't think I could do this without you." "You could," Calder said. "You'd find a way, but I'm glad I'm here to see it." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand was rough with calluses, gentle with intent, and Arden felt that touch like lightning through her entire body. "Arden," he said, her name rough in his mouth. "When this is over." A wolf howled, close enough to make them both turn sharply toward the sound. Then another howl answered, and another, coming from multiple directions around the herd. "Wake the others," Arden said, her hand already on her rifle. "Now!" The next hour was chaos. The wolves came in a pack, at least 7 or 8 animals, circling the herd and testing the defenses. The cattle were panicking again, pushing against each other and threatening another stampede. The 4 riders positioned themselves around the herd, firing into the air and at the ground near the wolves, trying to drive them off without starting a full-scale battle. Arden and Calder ended up back-to-back at one point, surrounded by circling shadows with gleaming eyes and bared teeth. She could feel the solid warmth of his shoulders against hers, could hear his steady breathing as he tracked targets in the darkness. "Left side," he said calmly. Arden swung her rifle and fired, the muzzle flash illuminating a gray shape that yelped and retreated. 2 more appeared on the right, and Calder's gun spoke twice in quick succession. They held that position for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, protecting each other's blind spots, moving in unconscious synchronization that came from trust and necessity. When the wolves finally gave up and melted back into the darkness, both of them were shaking with adrenaline and relief. "You all right?" Calder asked, turning to check her over in the dim light from the rekindled fire. I'm fine. You? Fine. He was still holding his rifle, still scanning the darkness for threats. That was too close. Everything about this drive has been too close, Arden said, and surprised herself by laughing. It came out slightly hysterical, born of exhaustion and fear and the sheer absurdity of their situation. Storms, stampedes, wolves. What's next? Locusts? Calder's mouth twitched. Don't tempt fate. I think fate stopped paying attention to us about 200 miles ago, Arden said. She looked at her crew, Rafa checking the herd for injuries, Tommy feeding the fire with shaking hands, and felt a surge of fierce pride. But we're still here. We're still moving forward. And we're going to make it to Cheyenne if I have to fight every wolf and storm between here and there. I believe you, Calder said, and the absolute conviction in his voice made Arden's heart clench. I'd follow you into hell if you asked, Arden Cole. And I'd bet on us walking back out again. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid and promises neither of them quite dared to make. Then Rafa called that he'd found an injured calf, and they went back to work, back to the endless demands of keeping 270 head of cattle alive and moving north. But something had changed between them in those dark hours of standing together against threats that should have broken them. Something had been acknowledged, even if not spoken aloud. They reached Cheyenne 4 days later, arriving at the stockyards with 268 head of exhausted but healthy cattle. Arden barely remembered the final miles. They blurred together in a haze of fatigue and desperate determination. But she remembered the moment she saw the city on the horizon, remembered the way her throat had closed with relief and disbelief that they'd actually made it. The stockyard manager took one look at their herd and whistled appreciatively. That's prime stock, miss. Where'd you drive from? Silver Bend, Colorado, Arden said, dismounting on legs that barely held her. 200 miles. 200... The manager blinked. And you're the owner? I'm the owner, Arden confirmed, too tired to care about his surprise. When's the next auction? Tomorrow afternoon, but if you're interested, I've got a buyer here now who's looking for exactly this kind of quality. Chicago meat packer, paying top dollar. Save you the auction fees and the wait. Arden's heart started pounding. How much? I'd have to let him make the offer, but these are good animals. Well-fed, healthy, despite the long drive. I'd say $23 a head, minimum. Maybe more if he's feeling generous. $23 a head. Arden did the math quickly. With 268 head, that was over $6,000. More than double what she needed for the bank. More than enough to save the ranch and have capital left over. Set up the meeting, she heard herself say. I'll negotiate directly. The buyer turned out to be a hard-eyed man from Chicago who tried to intimidate Arden into accepting $18 a head. She stood her ground, cited market prices and the quality of her stock, and refused to budge below 22. They settled at $23.50, and Arden walked away from the negotiation with a check for $6,178. She stared at the slip of paper in her hand, this proof that the impossible had just happened, and felt tears burn hot behind her eyes. They'd done it. Against every odd, every prediction, every voice that said she'd fail, they'd done it. Calder found her standing outside the stockyard office, staring at the check like it might disappear. He took one look at her face and smiled, slow and proud and brilliant. You did it, he said. We did it, Arden corrected. I couldn't have made it without you, without any of you. Maybe, Calder allowed, but you're the one who had the courage to try. That's what made the difference. Arden looked at this man who'd appeared in her life when she'd needed him most, who'd stood beside her through storms and stampedes and wolves and negotiations, who'd believed in her when belief seemed like the most foolish thing in the world. Thank you, she said, and knew the words were inadequate for everything she felt. For staying, for fighting with me, for making me believe this was possible. Calder's expression softened into something that made Arden's breath catch. I told you from the start, Arden, you match me just fine. And there, in the dusty street outside a Cheyenne stockyard, with a fortune in her hand and her crew celebrating nearby, Arden finally understood what he'd meant that first day in the mercantile. He hadn't been talking about wildness or impropriety or any of the things Silver Bend thought made her unfit. He'd been talking about courage, about the kind of fierce determination that refused to quit, about finding someone whose fight was worth joining because the person doing the fighting was worth believing in. They'd won. Against impossible odds, they'd won. But as Arden looked at Calder, at the way he was looking at her like she'd just accomplished something miraculous, she realized the cattle drive had been the easy part. The hard part, the terrifying part, was going to be figuring out what came next. They stayed in Cheyenne just long enough to deposit the check, purchase supplies for the journey home, and let both horses and humans recover from the brutal drive north. Arden found a boarding house that didn't blink at a woman traveling with 3 men, paid for 2 rooms and hot baths all around, and fell asleep that first night on an actual mattress with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that felt like victory. She woke before dawn out of habit, disoriented by the absence of cattle sounds and the softness beneath her back. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, her mind still caught in the rhythm of the trail. Wake, move, survive, repeat. Then memory flooded back and she sat up, pressing her hands against her face, half laughing and half sobbing with relief that felt almost painful. They'd done it. The check was real, deposited in a Cheyenne bank and transferable to Silver Bend. The impossible had become possible, and now she had to go home and prove to an entire town that had written her off that Arden Cole was nobody's failure. She found Calder already awake, sitting on the boarding house porch with coffee and the distant expression of a man thinking deep thoughts. He looked different with a few days' rest, younger somehow, the harsh lines of exhaustion softened by sleep and the knowledge that they'd succeeded. Couldn't sleep either? Arden asked, settling into the chair beside him. Slept fine. Just woke up early. He passed her his coffee cup without asking, a gesture that had become familiar over weeks of trail life. Been thinking about what happens when we get back. We pay the bank, Arden said. We watch Mayor Alden's face when I drop that payment on his desk. We prove everyone wrong. And after that? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them had fully addressed. On the trail there had been no time for anything beyond survival. But now, with success secured and home waiting, the future suddenly demanded attention. After that we rebuild, Arden said carefully. Restock the herd with the capital we have left, make repairs before winter, figure out next year's strategy. She paused. And I pay my crew the wages I owe them, plus bonuses for hazard duty. Calder's mouth quirked. Hazard duty, that's one way to describe wolves and stampedes. You earned it, Arden said firmly. All of you. Without you 3, I'd have nothing right now except foreclosure papers. About that, Calder said, his tone shifting into something more serious. About wages and the future and what comes next. He turned to look at her directly. I don't want wages anymore, Arden. Her stomach dropped. You're leaving. No, he said quickly. Opposite of leaving. I'm saying I want a stake, a partnership, something permanent instead of just being hired help. Arden stared at him, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. A partnership? The Cole Ranch needs more than seasonal hands, Calder said. It needs investment, expansion, someone with equal stake in making it succeed. You've proved you can run it, proved it to everyone who doubted, but you can't do everything alone, not forever. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. I've got savings from 15 years of work, not a fortune, but enough to buy into a partnership. We could expand the operation, bring in more breeding stock, maybe buy out one of the failing homesteads to the east and double your grazing land. Why? Arden asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why invest in a ranch that was almost foreclosed? Why tie yourself to a place that the whole county expected to fail? Because it didn't fail, Calder said simply. Because you didn't fail. And because I'm tired of drifting from place to place with nothing to show for it except worn-out boots and old stories. I want to build something, Arden. I want roots. And I can't think of anywhere I'd rather put them down than here. There was more in his words than a business proposition. Arden could hear it in his voice, see it in the way he was looking at her, like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking himself for years. It terrified her, this raw honesty, because accepting a partnership meant accepting that someone else's future was tied to hers, that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. I need to think about it, she said finally. Not because I don't want it, but because it's a big decision. Partnership means you're stuck with me, with this place, with everything that comes with it. I know, Calder said, and I'm asking anyway. They left Cheyenne the next morning, traveling light without a herd to slow them down. The journey home took 5 days instead of 3 weeks, and every mile brought Arden closer to the confrontation she'd been imagining since they'd first conceived this desperate plan. Silver Bend looked exactly the same when they rode back into town on a crisp October afternoon. The same dusty main street, the same weathered buildings, the same people who'd written her off as a foolish girl playing at ranching. But Arden felt different. She sat straighter in her saddle, met the startled stares with level confidence, and rode directly to the bank like she owned the entire town instead of just one struggling ranch. Harold Peterson was sweeping his front step when they passed, and his jaw actually dropped. "Miss Cole? We heard, the rumors said I'd fail," Arden called back pleasantly. Rumors were wrong. The bank was a small brick building at the corner of Main and First, its interior dim and cool and smelling of leather and paper. The clerk behind the counter looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from bored to shocked in the space of a heartbeat. "Miss Cole," he stammered, "we weren't expecting, that is, the payment isn't due for another—" "I'm aware of the due date," Arden said calmly. "Please inform Mr. Garrett that I'm here to settle my account. In full." The clerk practically ran to the back office, and Arden could hear the muffled conversation, the tone of disbelief in the banker's voice. Then Jonathan Garrett emerged, Silver Bend's bank manager and Mayor Alden's brother-in-law, his round face already flushed with confusion and something that looked like dismay. "Miss Cole," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is unexpected. The loan isn't due for 3 more weeks, and I must say I'm surprised to see you've returned from your venture." "Successful venture," Arden corrected. She reached into her coat and pulled out the bank draft, placing it on the counter with deliberate precision. $6,178 from Stockman's Bank of Cheyenne, $3,000 to settle the loan in full, plus interest. The remainder I'll be depositing into a new account under my name. Garrett stared at the draft like it was a snake. "This is... where did you—" "Cattle drive to Cheyenne," Arden said, letting satisfaction color her voice. 268 head sold at premium prices, as I told you I would when you tried to convince me to sell the ranch for half value. Now, Miss Cole, that's hardly fair." "What's not fair," Arden interrupted, her tone hardening, "is a bank manager conspiring with the mayor to force an early loan payment in hopes of triggering foreclosure. What's not fair is spreading rumors about my financial situation to potential buyers, trying to drive down the property value. What's not fair is treating me like an incompetent child instead of a legitimate rancher with legal rights and senior water claims." Garrett's face went from red to pale. "I don't know what you think you heard, but I heard the truth," Arden said, "from multiple sources. And while I can't prove it well enough to cause you legal trouble, I can make damn sure everyone in this town knows that Arden Cole paid her loan in full, ahead of schedule, after a successful cattle operation that none of you thought was possible." She leaned forward. "Process the payment, Mr. Garrett, and give me the receipt showing 0 balance owed." The banker's hands shook slightly as he processed the transaction, his clerk watching with wide eyes that promised the story would be all over town within the hour. When Garrett finally pushed the receipt across the counter, his expression was sour enough to curdle milk. "Congratulations, Miss Cole," he said stiffly. "Your loan is satisfied. Will there be anything else?" "Yes," Arden said. "I'm opening a business account with the remaining $3,000. And I want you to note in your records that the Cole Ranch is no longer a credit risk. In fact, we're expanding operations, so the next time someone asks about my financial situation, you tell them the truth, that I'm solvent, successful, and not going anywhere." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Mr. Garrett, you might want to inform your brother-in-law, the mayor, that his interested parties can stop circling. The Cole Ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." They walked out of that bank into afternoon sunlight that felt like vindication made tangible. Rafa was grinning like a wolf, Tommy was barely containing his excitement, and Calder's pride was evident in every line of his body. That, Rafa said, was beautiful. Watching Garrett's face when you put that draft on the counter, that was 30 years of satisfaction right there. I wish I could have seen Mayor Alden's face when he hears about it, Tommy added. You won't have to wait long, Calder observed, nodding toward the street. Mayor Alden was striding toward them with the purposeful gait of a man who'd just received bad news and needed someone to blame. His face was thunderous, his expensive suit somehow making him look more ridiculous than authoritative. Miss Cole, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I've just heard some rather remarkable claims about your recent activities. Not claims, Arden said pleasantly. Facts. I completed a successful cattle drive to Cheyenne, sold my herd at premium prices, and paid off my bank loan in full, with capital to spare for expansion. Would you like to see the receipt? This is outrageous, Alden sputtered. A woman, traveling alone with men, engaging in such dangerous and improper— I wasn't alone, Arden interrupted. I was with my crew, conducting legitimate business, which, last I checked, isn't illegal or improper in any legal sense that matters. The reputation of this town, Arden said, her voice cutting through his bluster, will survive me being a successful rancher. In fact, it might even improve once people realize that women are capable of more than you give them credit for. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of the mayor arguing with the woman he'd spent months undermining. Arden could see Mrs. Alden among them, her face twisted with fury. Harold Peterson was there too, and several other merchants, and even Sheriff Morrison watching with an expression of bemused interest. You've made powerful enemies with your stubbornness, Miss Cole, Alden said, lowering his voice to something that might have been meant as threatening. And you've made a mistake assuming that being a woman made me weak, Arden replied. I'm not selling. I'm not failing. I'm not going anywhere. The Cole Ranch is staying in Cole hands, and there's not a damn thing you or your friends can do about it. She brushed past him without waiting for a response, her crew falling into step behind her. The crowd parted, and Arden could feel dozens of eyes on her back, could practically hear the whispers starting. But for the first time since her father's death, she didn't care what Silver Bend thought. She'd proved them wrong. She'd done the impossible, and she'd done it on her own terms. They rode back to the ranch in the golden light of late afternoon, the valley spreading before them in shades of amber and green. Arden felt the tension of the last months finally beginning to ease, replaced by a bone-deep satisfaction that was sweeter than anything she'd ever experienced. The ranch house looked the same, solid, weathered, home, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a burden she was carrying alone anymore. It was a success she'd fought for and won, a legacy she'd defended against impossible odds. I'm accepting your offer, she said to Calder as they unsaddled their horses in the barn. The words came out before she'd consciously decided to speak them, but they felt right. The partnership, if you're still serious about it. Calder paused, his hands stilling on his saddle. I'm serious. Then we'll draw up papers, equal partnership in the Cole Ranch, or maybe we rename it Brooks and Cole, or Cole and Brooks. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. We can argue about the order later. Arden, Calder said, and something in his voice made her turn to face him fully. He set aside the saddle and crossed to where she stood, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. I need you to understand something. I'm not just investing in the ranch. I'm investing in you, in this life, in building something that lasts. I know, Arden said quietly. I don't think you do, Calder continued. I'm saying I want to stay, not just for a season, not just until the next opportunity comes along. I'm saying I want this to be home, with you. The words hung between them, heavy with implication and promise. Arden's heart was racing, her hands trembling slightly with the enormity of what he was offering. This was more than partnership. This was commitment. This was choosing each other in a way that went beyond business arrangements and practical considerations. I'm not easy to live with, Arden said, needing him to understand. I'm stubborn and independent, and I don't always listen to advice. I've spent my whole life fighting to prove I'm capable, and I'm not going to stop just because— I don't want you to stop, Calder interrupted. I don't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are. That's the whole point, Arden. I don't want to tame your wildness or fix your stubbornness or make you into something more acceptable to people like Mrs. Alden. I want to stand beside you while you keep being exactly who you've always been. Why? Arden asked, her voice breaking slightly. Why would you want that? Because 15 years ago, I lost someone I loved to fever. We were going to get married, build a life together, and when she died, I decided it was safer to never care that much again. Safer to keep moving, keep my distance, never invest in anything that could be taken away. He reached out and took her hands in his, rough calluses catching against her own work-worn skin. But then I met you, and you were so busy fighting for what you loved that you didn't have time to be careful or safe. And I realized that living carefully isn't the same as living well. That the risk of losing something matters less than the chance of having it in the first place. Arden felt tears burning hot behind her eyes. I'm scared, she admitted, of failing, of losing the ranch, of... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Calder seemed to understand. Of losing me, he said gently. I know. I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone. The barn was quiet around them, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light streaming through the gaps in the walls. Outside, she could hear Rafa and Tommy settling the horses, the familiar sounds of ranch life continuing as it always had. But in this moment, in this space between past and future, everything felt suspended. Stay then, Arden said, the words coming out fierce and certain despite the tears on her cheeks. Be my partner, in the ranch and in everything else. Help me build something that lasts. Calder's smile was brilliant, transforming his weathered face into something that made Arden's breath catch. I was hoping you'd say that. He kissed her then, gentle at first, and then deeper. And Arden felt something in her chest finally unclench. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, though she hadn't realized it until now. Not just the ranch, not just her father's legacy, but the chance to build a life on her own terms with someone who understood that her wildness wasn't something to be fixed. It was something to be celebrated. They drew up the partnership papers the next day with a lawyer from the county seat who didn't blink at a woman and a man entering equal business arrangements. Calder invested his savings, which turned out to be more substantial than Arden had expected. Nearly $2,000 accumulated over 15 years of careful work. Combined with her remaining capital, they had enough to buy the Henderson homestead to the east, which had failed the previous spring, adding another 160 acres to the Cole Ranch holdings. The town watched their partnership with varying degrees of scandal and grudging respect. Mrs. Alden made sure everyone knew it was improper for an unmarried woman to be in business with an unmarried man, but her poison lost its sting when the ranch began to visibly thrive. They hired 2 more hands, rebuilt the south fence line properly instead of just patching it, and brought in breeding stock that improved the quality of the entire herd. By December, when the first serious snow hit, the Cole Ranch was positioned better than it had been in years. The barn was full of hay, the cattle were healthy and well fed, the equipment was repaired and stored properly for winter, and Arden went to sleep each night in her father's house knowing that she'd done it. She'd saved the legacy he'd built, proved every doubter wrong, and created something even stronger than what she'd inherited. But more than that, she wasn't alone anymore. Calder moved into the main house after Thanksgiving, and though the town gossiped, Arden found she didn't care. They worked together during the day, planned strategies for the ranch over evening meals, and sat on the porch at night watching stars wheel overhead while discussing dreams that now included both of them. We should expand into horse breeding, Calder said one night in mid-December, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. Good market for quality stock, and we've got the grazing land for it now. Horses are more work than cattle, Arden pointed out, but she was already considering the logistics. But yes, we could start small, maybe 5 or 6 broodmares, see how it goes. And next fall, we do another Cheyenne drive, build up capital, establish a reputation as a reliable supplier. And eventually we won't need Cheyenne. We'll be successful enough that buyers come to us. Arden smiled, letting herself imagine a future that stretched years ahead, instead of just to the next loan payment. My father would have loved this, all of it. The expansion, the success, the... She paused. You think so? I know so. He always said the mark of a good rancher wasn't how much land you had, but whether you had the guts to fight for it when times got hard. You've got those guts, Calder. You proved it on the trail, in the bank, every day since you arrived. Calder pulled her closer, and Arden let herself lean into his warmth. We proved it together, he corrected. That's what partnership means, fighting together, winning together, building something neither of us could have managed alone. The winter passed in a blur of hard work and hard-won contentment. They survived 2 blizzards, lost only 3 head to cold, and even managed to help their neighbors when the Patterson Ranch got hit with pneumonia in their herd. The gesture surprised people. Arden Cole helping other ranchers instead of just defending her own interests, but it paid dividends and changed attitudes. Slowly, grudgingly, Silver Bend began to accept that the woman they'd written off was here to stay. By the time spring arrived, thawing the valley and bringing new grass to the pastures, Arden had made her decision about the other question that had been hanging between her and Calder since that day in the barn. She found him working on the new corral they were building for the horse breeding operation, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the cool morning. He looked up as she approached, and something in her expression made him set down his tools. "You look serious," he said. "Good, serious, or bad serious?" "Good serious," Arden said. I hope." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Marry me." Calder blinked. "What?" "Marry me," Arden repeated more firmly this time. "I know it's not how it's supposed to go. The man's supposed to ask, the woman's supposed to wait, but I'm tired of doing things the way they're supposed to be done. I want to marry you, Calder. I want to build this life together officially, legally, permanently. He kissed her, cutting off her words, and when he pulled back, he was laughing and shaking his head. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I've been carrying a ring around for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment." "You have a ring?" Calder dug into his pocket and produced a simple gold band, worn but solid, that caught the morning light. "It was my grandmother's. Only valuable thing I own. I've been waiting for the perfect moment, but I should have known you'd beat me to it." Arden took the ring, turning it in her fingers, feeling the weight of history and promise it carried. "Is that a yes, then?" "That's a yes," Calder confirmed. "To all of it. Marriage, partnership, building this life together. Everything." They married in late April, in the small church in Silver Bend with Rafa and Tommy as witnesses, and half the town in attendance out of curiosity, if not goodwill. Arden wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and Calder wore his best suit, which he'd had to buy special for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, traditional in all the ways that mattered, and revolutionary in the context of who they were and what they represented. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Arden Cole, now Arden Brooks, though she'd keep using Cole for ranch business, felt something settle in her chest that she'd been missing since her father died. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of something new. Partnership. Family. Home. The reception was held at the ranch, and to Arden's surprise, even some of their former critics showed up. Mayor Alden stayed away, but several merchants came, and even a few of the other ranchers who'd been skeptical about a woman running cattle operations. They ate barbecue and drank whiskey and toasted the new couple with varying degrees of sincerity. Harold Peterson pulled Arden aside at one point, his weathered face earnest. "I owe you an apology, Miss Cole, Mrs. Brooks. I doubted you. Most of us did. But you proved us wrong in the best possible way." "I had help," Arden said, glancing at where Calder was talking with Rafa and some of the other hands. "Couldn't have done it alone." "Maybe not," Peterson agreed. "But you were the one who had the courage to try. That counts for something, counts for everything, really." As the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Arden stood on her porch, their porch, and watched her neighbors and crew celebrating in the yard. The ranch her father had built, that she'd fought to save, that she and Calder were now building into something even greater. The life she'd chosen, the man she'd chosen, the future spreading out before them full of possibility and promise. Calder appeared beside her, sliding an arm around her waist. "Happy?" "Terrified," Arden admitted. "Happy, but terrified. What if we can't sustain this? What if next year brings drought or disease or—" "Then we'll fight through it," Calder said simply. Same as we've fought through everything else. Together. Together. The word that changed everything. Arden leaned into her husband's warmth and watched the stars begin to appear overhead. The same stars her father had watched. The same stars that would shine long after they were both gone. The ranch would endure. The land would endure. And the legacy of Arden Cole, the wild woman who refused to be tamed, who fought impossible odds and won, would endure too. Not because she'd done it alone, but because she'd been brave enough to let someone stand beside her. The first year of their marriage passed in the kind of hard work that builds foundations strong enough to last generations. Arden and Calder expanded the horse breeding operation, adding 12 mares to their initial 5 and bringing in a quality stallion from Kentucky that cost nearly everything they'd saved from the Cheyenne sale. It was a gamble, but one that paid off when their first crop of foals arrived the following spring. Long-legged, strong-boned animals that had buyers asking questions before they were even weaned. The ranch prospered in ways that had seemed impossible during those dark months after Thomas Cole's death. They hired 3 more permanent hands, built a second barn for the horses, and negotiated contracts with buyers in Denver and Cheyenne that guaranteed steady income even in lean years. The Cole Ranch, officially renamed Cole Brooks Ranch on the new gateposts Calder carved that summer, became known throughout Colorado Territory as a source of quality cattle and superior horses. But it was the personal victories that meant more to Arden than any financial success. The day Mrs. Alden crossed the street rather than face her in town, a small smile of defeat on her carefully painted face. The afternoon Mayor Alden stopped by the ranch with a stiff request to purchase 2 horses for the county, his pride clearly choking him, but his need for quality stock stronger than his wounded ego. The evening Rafa told them he was retiring, not because he doubted their ability to run things, but because he was finally confident they didn't need him anymore. "You've built something real here," the old foreman said, his eyes suspiciously bright. Thomas would be proud. "Hell, I'm proud. You took a dying ranch and turned it into an empire." "It's not an empire," Arden protested, but Calder squeezed her hand. "Not yet," he said, grinning. "Give us another 5 years." The second autumn brought news that changed everything again, though in ways Arden hadn't anticipated. She'd been feeling odd for weeks, tired in a way that extra sleep didn't fix, queasy in the mornings, emotional over things that normally wouldn't have bothered her. She'd ignored it, chalking it up to the stress of managing an expanding operation, until the day she fainted while helping break a new horse. Calder had been beside her in an instant, his face white with fear. "We're going to the doctor, now. I don't care if you have to argue about it." Dr. Morrison was an older man who'd delivered half the babies in Silver Bend, and he took one look at Arden's symptoms, asked 3 pointed questions, and smiled in a way that made her heart start racing for entirely new reasons. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brooks," he said. "You're going to be a mother." The ride back to the ranch was silent, both of them processing the news. A baby, a child, the next generation of what they were building. It terrified Arden in ways that facing down stampedes and bank managers never had. "Say something," she finally said as they approached the ranch gates. "I'm trying to figure out what to say," Calder admitted. "I'm scared and excited and worried and happy all at once. Is that normal?" "I think so," Arden said. "I feel like the world just tilted sideways. Everything we've been building, suddenly it's not just for us anymore. It's for them. For this person who doesn't even exist yet, but already changes everything." Calder reined in his horse and turned to look at her fully. "Are you happy about it?" "Yes," Arden said, and realized it was true despite the fear. "Yes, I'm happy. Terrified, but happy. You?" "Same," Calder said, and his smile was tremulous but genuine. "We can do this, right? Run a ranch and raise a child? People do it all the time." "People do it all the time," Arden agreed, "though most of them probably don't have a ranch this size to manage while they're doing it. Then we'll hire more help. We'll figure it out. Same way we figured out everything else, together." The pregnancy was difficult in ways Arden hadn't expected. The morning sickness lasted well into her 4th month, and the physical demands of ranch work became increasingly challenging as her body changed. She hated feeling limited, hated having to ask for help with tasks she'd always done herself, hated the way people in town looked at her with a mixture of concern and satisfaction, as if her pregnancy proved she was finally becoming properly domestic. "You should rest more," Mrs. Henderson said one day in the Mercantile, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A woman in your condition shouldn't be out working like a common ranch hand." "A woman in my condition is still perfectly capable of managing her own ranch," Arden replied, keeping her voice level despite her irritation. "But thank you for your concern." Calder had to physically restrain her from punching Mayor Alden's son when the young man made a crude joke about whether the baby would be born in the barn like the rest of the livestock. It took 3 people to pull her back, and even then she was shaking with rage. "He's not worth it," Calder said later when they were alone and Arden was still fuming. "He's an idiot trying to get a rise out of you." "He succeeded," Arden said bitterly, "and now the whole town is going to talk about how the pregnant ranch woman tried to fight a man in the street." "Let them talk," Calder said. "They've been talking since the day you took over this ranch. Hasn't stopped you yet." But it wore on her, the constant judgment and the physical limitations and the fear of what childbirth would mean. Her mother had died in childbirth, bleeding out while bringing Arden's stillborn brother into the world. The memory of her father's devastated face haunted Arden's dreams as her due date approached. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked Calder one night in their bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly, where their child moved and kicked with increasing vigor. "What if I die like my mother did?" "You won't," Calder said, but she could hear the fear underlying his certainty. "You don't know that. Women die in childbirth all the time, and if I do—" "Stop," Calder said firmly. "I can't think about that. I won't think about that. You're strong, Arden, stronger than anyone I've ever met. You'll get through this the same way you've gotten through everything else." "And if I don't, who'll run the ranch? Then I'll run it," Calder interrupted. "And I'll raise our child and tell them every day about their mother, who was the bravest, stubbornest, most magnificent person I ever knew. But that's not going to happen, because you're going to be fine. We both are." The baby came on a cold March evening, 3 weeks before Arden's due date, and in the middle of the worst spring storm in 5 years. The pain started just after sunset, and by the time they realized this was actual labor and not false contractions, the roads were impassable with mud and melting snow. "I'll ride for the doctor," Tommy volunteered, already reaching for his coat. "You'll break your neck trying to get down that road," Arden gasped between contractions. "It's too dangerous." "So what do we do?" Calder asked, and Arden had never heard that much fear in his voice before. "We manage," she said, trying to sound confident despite the pain radiating through her body. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years without doctors. We can do this." What followed were the longest 8 hours of Arden's life. Calder stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, bringing water, helping her walk when she needed to move, catching her when her knees buckled. Tommy and the other hands stayed discreetly in the bunkhouse, probably terrified by the sounds coming from the main house, and Arden fought through pain that made stampedes and bank negotiations seem trivial by comparison. "I can't," she sobbed at one point, exhausted and hurting and convinced this was how she'd die. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Calder said, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "You're the strongest person I know. You drove cattle 200 miles through storms and wolf attacks. You faced down a town that wanted you to fail. You can do this." "This is different. This is just another impossible thing," Calder said. "And you've made a career out of doing impossible things. So do this one more. Bring our baby into the world. Show them what it means to be born to Arden Brooks." She did, finally, as dawn was breaking over the snow-covered mountains and the storm was beginning to clear. A sun, red-faced and squalling, perfect in every way that mattered. Calder cut the cord with shaking hands, wrapped the baby in clean blankets, and placed him in Arden's arms with an expression of such profound love and relief that it made her start crying all over again. "You did it," he whispered, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You did it." "We did it," Arden corrected, looking down at the tiny face of her son, at the dark hair and the slate blue eyes that would probably turn gray like his father's. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Now, holding this small person who represented everything they'd built and fought for, Arden knew exactly what his name should be. Thomas, she said. Thomas Calder Brooks, after both his grandfathers. Calder's eyes filled with tears. Your father would have loved that. Would have loved him. He'll know this ranch the way I did, Arden said, already planning ahead despite her exhaustion. He'll learn every inch of this land, understand what it means to fight for something worth keeping, and he'll never doubt that he was born from love and courage and two people who refused to let impossible odds stop them. Dr. Morrison arrived 2 hours later once the roads were passable enough for travel. He examined both Arden and the baby, declared them both remarkably healthy considering the circumstances, and shook his head in amused exasperation. Only you, Mrs. Brooks, would deliver a baby in the middle of a storm without medical help and somehow make it look easy. It wasn't easy, Arden said, exhausted but grinning, but we managed. Of course you did, Morrison said. You always do. The news of Thomas Brooks' birth spread through Silver Bend with predictable speed, and the reactions were mixed. Some people were genuinely happy, bringing gifts and offering congratulations. Others seemed disappointed that Arden had survived childbirth, their hopes of the troublesome woman ranch owner dying in labor going unfulfilled. Arden ignored both reactions with equal grace, too consumed with learning how to be a mother to care what the town thought. The first months were brutal in new ways. The baby needed constant attention, and running a ranch didn't pause for infant care. Arden found herself nursing Thomas in the barn while supervising horse training, conducting business meetings with the baby strapped to her chest in a sling Calder fashioned from old fabric, and learning to function on 3 hours of sleep broken into impossible fragments. This is harder than the Cheyenne drive, she told Calder one night as they took turns walking a colicky baby around the bedroom. At least on the drive I could sleep for a few hours straight. But you didn't have to worry about the baby spitting up on important contracts, Calder pointed out, taking Thomas from her so she could rest. Trade-offs. Despite the exhaustion, Arden found herself happier than she'd imagined possible. Watching Calder with their son, the gentle way he handled the tiny body, the soft voice he used when singing old trail songs as lullabies, the fierce protectiveness that flared whenever anyone suggested Arden was working too hard, made her fall in love with him all over again. And watching Thomas grow, seeing him develop his own personality, imagining him running through these same fields she'd run through as a child, made every struggle worthwhile. The ranch continued to expand. By Thomas's first birthday, they'd doubled their horse breeding operation and were shipping cattle as far as Chicago. They bought another adjacent property, bringing their total holdings to over 1,000 acres. They hired a manager for the day-to-day operations, freeing Arden and Calder to focus on strategic planning and spending time with their son. Mayor Alden died of a heart attack when Thomas was 2, and his replacement was a younger man with more progressive views who actually sought Arden's input on county business. Mrs. Alden moved to Denver to live with her daughter, taking her poisoned tongue and social climbing with her. The town slowly transformed from a place that had tried to destroy Arden into a community that grudgingly, then genuinely, respected what she'd built. On Thomas's 3rd birthday, they held a party at the ranch that drew nearly 100 people. Ranchers, merchants, neighbors, friends. People who'd witnessed Arden's journey from grieving daughter to successful ranch owner to wife and mother. As she watched her son playing with other children in the yard, surrounded by people who'd become family, Arden felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died. Peace. Calder found her standing on the porch, watching the celebration with distant eyes. What are you thinking about? Everything, Arden admitted. That day in the Mercantile when you first arrived. The drive to Cheyenne. The day we almost lost everything. How impossible it all seemed. She turned to look at him. Do you remember what you said to Mrs. Alden when she was mocking me for trying to run the ranch? I said you'd match me just fine, Calder recalled, smiling at the memory. Did you know then? Arden asked. Did you know we'd end up here? No, Calder said honestly. I knew you were worth fighting for. I knew I was tired of running, but I didn't know we'd build all this. He gestured at the ranch, the people, their son laughing as he chased a puppy around the yard. I hoped, maybe, but I didn't know. I was so angry that day, Arden said. So scared and alone and desperate. I thought I had to do everything myself or I'd prove them all right about me being unfit. And then you realized you didn't have to do it alone, Calder said, that accepting help wasn't weakness. You taught me that, Arden said softly. You and this place, and that impossible drive, and everything that came after. That strength isn't about fighting alone. It's about knowing when to stand with someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. Thomas came running up then, his face sticky with cake and his new puppy at his heels. Mama, Papa, come play. They followed him back to the party, to the life they'd built from ashes and determination and love. As the sun set over the valley, painting everything gold, Arden thought about her father and the legacy he'd left her. Not just land and cattle and buildings, but the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Years passed. Thomas grew tall and strong, learning to ride before he could read, absorbing ranch wisdom the way desert sand absorbs water. When he was 8, they gave him his first calf to raise, teaching him responsibility and the value of hard work. When he was 10, he helped with his first cattle drive, earning the respect of the hands with his fearlessness and skill. By the time Thomas was 12, the Cole Brooks Ranch was one of the most successful operations in Colorado. They ran 1,500 head of cattle, bred horses that sold for premium prices across 3 states, and employed 20 permanent hands plus seasonal workers during busy times. The original ranch house had been expanded twice, and they'd built a separate foreman's house and a bunkhouse that could sleep 30 men. But more than the physical expansion, it was the change in perception that mattered most to Arden. Young women from across the territory wrote her letters, asking for advice on managing their own ranches, on standing up to men who doubted them, on being taken seriously in a world that preferred they be silent and decorative. Arden answered every letter, offering hard-won wisdom and encouragement, paying forward the belief that Calder had shown her that first day. One spring evening, when Thomas was 15 and already as tall as his father, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a family tradition that had survived every challenge and change. Thomas was talking about his plans for the future, about innovations in cattle breeding he'd read about wanting to go to agricultural college in Denver when he was older. "You'll run this place someday," Arden told him, the words carrying weight and promise. "And you'll make it even better than we did." "I want to," Thomas said seriously, "but I also want to do it my way. Try new things, maybe expand into sheep, or do whatever makes sense for the time you're living in," Calder interrupted. "That's what running a ranch means, adapting, fighting for what matters, refusing to let other people's limitations become your own." "Is that what you did, Ma?" Thomas asked. "When Grandpa died and everyone said you'd fail?" Arden shared a look with Calder, remembering that desperate, terrifying time. "That's exactly what I did. Everyone had very clear ideas about what I couldn't do. Couldn't run a ranch, couldn't manage money, couldn't survive on my own. And they were almost right. I couldn't do it alone. But I wasn't alone. I had people who believed in me." She reached for Calder's hand. "I had your father, who walked into the worst day of my life and decided I was worth fighting for." "Tell me the story again," Thomas said, though he'd heard it dozens of times, about the mercantile and what Papa said. So Arden told him the way she would tell their grandchildren years later, the way it would eventually become family legend, passed down through generations. The story of a woman called Wild and Unfit, of a cowboy who saw strength instead of scandal, of impossible odds overcome through courage and partnership, and refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. "And then your father looked at Mrs. Alden and everyone else who'd been mocking me," Arden said, reaching the part Thomas loved best. "And he said 5 words that changed my life." "Good. You'll match me just fine," Thomas recited along with her, grinning. "Good. I'll match you just fine," Arden corrected, squeezing Calder's hand. "Because it wasn't about me matching him. It was about us matching each other. Finding someone who understood that wild didn't need to be tamed, that different didn't mean wrong, that strength could look like a lot of things people didn't expect." The sun touched the horizon, flooding the valley with light that turned everything golden. The land Thomas Cole had claimed, that Arden had fought to keep, that she and Calder had expanded into something even greater than its origins. 3 generations of courage and determination made manifest in grass and water and cattle and horses and the family who tended them. "I'm glad Papa stayed," Thomas said. "Glad he saw what you were worth." "I'm glad I let him stay," Arden replied. "Glad I was brave enough to accept help instead of insisting on doing everything alone." That was the hardest lesson. Learning that strength isn't about isolation. It's about building something with people who share your vision. Years later, when Arden and Calder were old and silver-haired but still sharp as tacks, still running the ranch with Thomas and his wife, they would stand on that same porch and watch their grandson, another Thomas, playing in the yard. And Arden would think about that terrified, desperate girl in the mercantile, so certain she had to prove herself alone, so afraid of failing her father's memory. She'd think about the impossible cattle drive that saved everything, about wolves and stampedes and negotiations that could have gone either way, about the day she'd paid off the bank loan and proved an entire town wrong, about the night she'd given birth in a storm with only Calder to help her, fighting through pain to bring new life into the world they'd built. But most of all, she'd think about standing in the middle of that mercantile with judgment raining down around her, and a stranger with dust on his boots stepping forward to say the words that would change everything. "You know what I realized?" Arden said to Calder on one of those evenings, watching their grandson chase chickens while Thomas laughed and tried to corral him. "That day in the mercantile, you didn't save me. You saw me clearly when everyone else was looking at what they expected to see. That was the real gift. Not rescue, but recognition." "You saved yourself," Calder agreed. "I just had the good sense to stand beside you while you did it." "We saved each other," Arden corrected. "You from running, me from fighting alone. That's what love is, I think. Not completing each other, but choosing to face everything together. Building something that lasts not because it's perfect, but because both people refuse to quit." They'd built an empire from nothing but determination and each other. The Colbrooks Ranch would outlast them both, carrying their legacy forward through children and grandchildren and beyond. But the real legacy wasn't the land or the cattle or the success. It was the proof that impossible things became possible when you found someone brave enough to stand beside you. When you refused to let other people's limitations define your future. When you looked at what everyone said couldn't be done and said, "Watch me do it anyway." The wild girl of Silver Bend had become a legend. The mysterious cowboy drifter had found his home. And together they'd created something that proved what Calder had known from the very beginning, from that first moment in a dusty mercantile, when he'd seen past the judgment to the courage underneath. They matched each other just fine. And in matching, they'd built something extraordinary. The sun set over the Colbrooks Ranch, as it had set 10,000 times before, and would set 10,000 times more. The land endured. The legacy endured. The story of courage and partnership and refusing to be anything other than exactly who you were meant to be. That story endured most of all. It would be told around campfires and dinner tables, in boardrooms and bunkhouses, wherever people gathered to talk about what was possible when you stopped letting fear make your decisions. The wild woman and the drifting cowboy who chose each other, chose courage, chose to build a life that honored both their strengths instead of apologizing for them. And somewhere, in whatever place Thomas Cole's spirit had gone, Arden liked to think her father was watching, proud of what she'd preserved, proud of what she'd built beyond preservation, proud that his daughter had taken his legacy and transformed it into something even greater than he'd imagined. The impossible had become reality. The outcast had become the pillar. The woman they'd called unfit had proven herself more capable than any of them. And it all started with 5 words from a stranger who understood what no one else could see. "Good. You'll match me just fine."